Hey, what's up, guys? Casino Crime here, back again for a continuation of the series focusing on beating low and micro stakes PLO. You know what I think I'm going to do eventually, as I continue to make more videos, is do a series focused more on beating the 200 PLO and above type limits. But for now, I think it's a good time to focus on beating the low and micro limits. I know there's a lot of guys in the community that are really trying to uh, nail down the fundamentals and beat these limits before they move up, which I think is a good strategy and pretty common overall. You know what? I get a pretty common question that I get is, what's the best approach to moving up? Like, how much money should I buy in for? How many tables should I play? Like, which resources should I buy first? And, uh, you know, it's going to be a varied answer, but, uh, something that I think that people don't talk about enough is it's not really how much you're willing to buy in for. It's more your willingness to reload and move down if necessary. A piece of advice that I give to pretty much all players in terms of bankroll management is to, the best thing you can do for a poker player is to identify the games that you know that you can beat, right? Um, you can take almost an infinite amount of shots and be pretty aggressive with your bankroll if you have a game that you know that you can consistently beat and make money from. For me, for example, back when I was living in Vegas, like I knew that no matter what, as long as I stayed mentally sane, I could pretty much guarantee that I would always be able to beat 2-5 no limit, for example. So if a good shot taking opportunity came around, at least I knew that like I could grind a few extra hours. Maybe my hourly might be a little lower playing 2-5 no limit, but at least like I could always pay the bills with 2-5 no limit. And I think that as long as you're willing to like move down and grind, you can be pretty aggressive with your bankroll. But if you're not like willing to move down and grind, then that requires you to be a little bit more conservative with your bankroll. So that would be the advice that I would give for bankroll management. If you're completely like new to the game and you're just trying to deposit some money and play these types of limits, I'd say like $500 to $1,000 would be the minimum for me personally. If you're, again, like it depends a little bit on psychologically how it affects you. I'm going to play these hands and then continue talking about that topic. So we have a very strong hand on table 2. Ace, Queen, Jack 10 double suited. Let's play for more money. This is just like a great hand. And at these levels, I've talked a little bit about how I like to play tighter and more straightforward against pot-sized opens. But here, like our hand is so strong even against aces, which is worst case scenario, of course. Like we're still getting the right odds to call a 4-bet. And I think against most opening ranges for players at this level, we're happily 3-betting this for value. And he just folds. So again, like we talked a little bit about things that I would take note of. That's certainly something that I would take note of. This guy here, he's opening almost for pot. I guess it was like 79, which is less than pot somehow. He must have just like typed that in. But he opened for pot from middle position and then folded to a 3-bet, and I think that that's pretty uncommon at these levels. So I would assume that he has like a really high fold to 3-bet. So against that type of player, I would be looking to 3-bet up with a higher frequency, and we would just assume that he's going to play more straightforward overall. And in general, like if when you're breaking down a player and you're looking for situations where you can extrapolate some knowledge, like you see them do one thing and you want to you want to see how it correlates to like other situations. That would be something that I would pick up on. He's straightforward in that situation. A player who's folding to a lot of 3-bets is typically like straightforward post flop, and you can be pretty confident that when he puts some aggression into the pot, he's gonna just have it. And that's kind of how I view low stakes in general. If you're trying to beat the low stakes, I pretty much just if you guys are trying to work on a certain skill in terms of the lower stakes, I would I would really work on developing better default lines against different player types. Um, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. So back in the day, I used to play a lot of Zoom. Well, a lot of Rush, I guess. It was on full tilt. And something that I did was I would always color code each player, and I would spend time before my session actually color coding as many players as I could. And this is actually because back in the day, a HUD didn't work for Rush in the beginning. So all you really had to go by was like your notes and your color coding. And my goal was to be able to, um, you know, have like everybody color coded, so I had a good idea of what the lobby was like overall and everything like that. But what was even better was that like I could, I did focus a little bit on the dynamic with each player, but at least back in the day, the games were such that like if somebody had someone who was tight, I would label them as yellow, right? Well, I could take like certain lines against the yellow players and certain lines against the red players who are like bad aggressive players. I think that that's kind of like what I'm getting at is most players at the low levels don't deviate from their template. Like a tight player doesn't suddenly wake up out of nowhere and become not tight, much like a loose passive player doesn't wake up out of nowhere and you know become. I'm gonna rewind here and become not and become like super aggressive or tight. So you can kind of just assume when you pick up on one tendency from a player that they're going to stick with that. And I apologize, I got a little bit sidetracked and I rewound too much, but we can fix that. Okay, so it looks like we opened Ace King 7-8 for pot in the cutoff. And, what do I think about this open? It's not good. I kind of mentioned in the previous videos that I tried to play as many pots as possible, so you're going to see me getting in there with some pretty speculative hands. In general, I would not open this. I would pretty much fold this in almost any game. So if you guys are watching this video and saying, what the fuck, Casino Crime, like why are you opening Ace King 7-8 with an 8 high suit? That's actually a good sign. But in certain situations, it's probably not the worst open in the world. I mean, one thing that we do have going for us is we have an ace and a king blocker, so it's less likely that we're going to get 3-bet. If a button was particularly tight, and there was a particularly poor player in one of the blinds, I wouldn't mind opening this as much. But in general, this is a pretty bad hand to open anywhere from the button. If it folded to me on the button, I would open it in any game. But button in the small blind fold, big blind calls. We see bet the flop and get called. And it's interesting to think about your play from both sides, right? Like from what should your calling range be from in the big blind or on the flop here, and what should our betting range be on the flop in our position. Of course, like we're going to be betting this flop as much as possible. And in certain situations, I would check back sets here if I thought someone was particularly stabby. In live games, something that's fun is if you have a value hand on this type of flop and you get a read that someone's check giving up, it's one of those spots that you actually can check back and see if you can induce a bluff. Like if you know that they're just always going to be folding. But in general, like my default online is to just be betting this with a high frequency. I find that, especially, like here our hand is ace king 7-8. We're likely ahead, but there's certainly hands that have equity against us, and it's kind of nice to just bet and take it down. And our hand is certainly like strong-ish, but I don't know how on a lot of different runouts it's not going to be very strong. So I prefer to just bet and kind of take it from there and assume we have the best hand, get some value from worse sometimes, and kind of do that. I would have liked to have seen myself bet the turn. And frankly, I'm not sure what my reasoning was for checking back. I think I thought that he was just weak and was going to be... Maybe I just thought that he was weak and was going to be like stabbing the river or something. I don't know, but I would prefer to just bet that turn for value and then check back most rivers rather than like check back and call a bet. But he does fold. So I think, like for whatever reason, I decided to take a tricky line. But in general, like I would have preferred to just bet the turn, especially, it brought a flush draw. Like we do have the ace of hearts, but it seems less relevant because it's not like he's going to fold a flush if it does run out of flush anyway. So it's less relevant having the ace of hearts. So yeah, I would just prefer to bet the turn. I like the flop bet. Don't like the turn bet as much. And as we've seen in a lot of these hands, like really, again, and I've harped on this many times, but where you just print money at the low stakes is c-betting and barreling. Opening preflop, c-betting and barreling. Pretty much as you can. There's, of course, good spots to check back, but in general, that's where you can print money. People play pretty straightforward, as we've seen it. I decided not to bet this flop. I think it's okay. You could bet in some situations. I certainly wouldn't hate a bet, but it's just a really wet flop. And kind of connects with his range better than it does mine. So I decided to check, and I would imagine I was just giving up. And checking, trying to get to showdown, and we win. So that's nice. I would like to see what he had. Hopefully I bring it up. Here on table 4, I imagine that I ISO. Which again, just like for the no limit players, I mean, at the low stakes, you can really print some money by just isolating limpers and c-betting and taking it down. So that's what we're going to try to do here. The limper folds. And this is just a flop that I'm going to be betting with a very high frequency. For the no limit guys who are trying to make the transition to PLO, you might wonder why this isn't a good spot to check back and see a turn, allow ourselves to realize our gut shot equity and maybe our two pair equity. But something that again, I like to see, but at the lower stakes, I certainly like to keep my c-betting frequency as high as possible. As you move up in stakes, there becomes more leveling in terms of checking back and getting people to stab and calling down lighter. But at the lower levels, I prefer to just bet because people peel much wider than you think, and it's so much easier to play the hand when you have the initiative. And in some runouts, we might try to make a king fold. And although when we get called here, we're beat some of the time, we're getting a good price on our c-bet, and we definitely have equity when called. Interesting turn. I still think that we're good enough of the time that we should just bet for protection and then check back the river. I think that checking is also fine. It's not bad. He could have a lot of ace-king combos. Certainly jack-queen combos are in there. I will say that I'm a lot more likely to bet here when I have the jack blocker than when I don't have the jack blocker. I know that seems like a kind of nitpicky difference, but I think it makes enough of a difference that one is a check back and one is a close bet. If he leads here, I mean, I think that actually folding is totally fine. Hopefully I do fold, because I don't think that many people bluff here. So many jack-queen combos in his range. He could be value betting ace-king, I guess, but most players won't even value bet that. We don't have a diamond blocker. And yeah, it's just he's not going to turn ace-5 into a bluff. And it's impossible for him to get there with a bluff, pretty much. So yeah, just fold. Even though we're getting he laid us a pretty good price. I would imagine we open this from the cutoff. Again, is it a great open? No, but we're trying to play some hands and get ourselves in some spots. Again, in the right dynamic in any game, I would open this if the button is tight enough. This is a fine open. Again, it's nice having the ace and the king. I mean, we don't want the ace and the king to be suited. We would prefer if it was ace-9 suited and then 2 other offsuit cards. But in this scenario, if the button was tight and there was a poor player in the big blind, I would open it a lot of the time. And in general, as an overall 6-max strategy, I do whatever I can to keep my image as loose as possible, so that I get paid. My typical strategy is to play very tight from the small blind and under the gun, but look for as many opening opportunities as I can from the cutoff and on the button. People just don't really pay enough attention to like your positional stats, especially at these levels, as they should. Like, as long as they see that I'm overall playing like a 29, 22, they're gonna at least view me as like being aggressive enough to get paid. And that's kind of like the recipe for making money at six max. Is, let's see, and I do check back. I mean, I'm torn with the check back. I could go both ways. You should typically have a very high c-bet percentage on this board, but the fact that we have the nut flush draw, the fact that we have like a six and a backdoor straight draw, I think that makes it a little bit better to check back and try to like see a turn and preserve some equity. Curious to see what I do now. I mean, it's tough to represent aces because I checked back the flop. I wouldn't hate like a turn bet and a river bet. That'd be okay. And I think I just check back and try to win. Yep. So I think given the action and like that I have an ace and a king, it makes it more of a bet. But if called, you are likely going to have to bet twice in order to win the pot. So we were talking a little bit about bankroll management, which I think is important. A lot of people ask about bankroll management and want to know. I think what people really want to know is what's the least I can deposit and have the best chance of like running it up. You know, there's no real like magic answer for that. At some point, you're gonna have to risk something if you really plan on making any money playing poker. And on the bottom left table, we see bet. So I think it's kind of a poor way to look at it as like a get rich quick scheme. If you're really trying to actually have some consistent long-term success in poker, you should be thinking just more in terms of how do I improve, not how much money I can make in the next month or two. As long as you continue to improve your game, you will move up and make more. I could have easily like potted this turn on table 3. I think that their ranges are both pretty wide, and they should be just like folding a lot. So I would have preferred to have seen myself just like pot the turn. Frankly, I don't like how I played that hand. And actually going back to that hand, let's talk about it a little bit more. Okay, reasons for why I like potting the turn. Well, this is a really good example of sort of the like overall this is kind of how like the low stakes goes, right? Players flop ranges are super wide. They don't like to fold for like a buck or whatever it is. And you can really get people view pot size bets as being very strong. So, although clearly we don't have the best hand, we can really push like hands that beat us out of the pot very easily with like a pot size bet. And sometimes like, people can certainly have like 7-9, but Queen 9 is less likely to be slow playing on this board. And one thing that's nice about potting the turn is that we have a lot of leverage in this kind of situation. And the reason we have a lot of leverage is, by potting the turn, we're effectively leveraging an all-in on the river. So especially like with these guys to stack these players, the stack depths of these two players, they're kind of like risking an all-in when we're risking only 8, which is good. And sometimes they'll like call and then fold the river. Like, players hate folding sets, for example. So you can definitely like win it on the river sometimes too. So I would prefer just betting it. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. Like when you see them turn over their hands, you're like, oh my god, like what the fuck are they doing with these hands? And you see that, you just kind of see that a lot at the low stakes. So don't be afraid to put in like big bets when you sense weakness. So, yeah, I mean, I would say, if I had to deposit and play like 25 cent, 50 cent, $2,000 should be plenty to work with. You can buy in for $1,000, but just be ready to reload. I think that especially if you're like totally new, you should absolutely be ready to reload. Um, it just depends on your experience level and your willingness to reload for the most part. That's how you judge like bankroll management. Checking this flop, which I think is okay. Or let's see, yeah. Flop is set on table one. Imagine we just bet. And I think like if you're folding this from early position or middle position, that's fine. But again, like I was trying to play some hands. This guy pots the turn. We call. I think it's pretty standard. And we chop. Looks good. I would imagine that I'd bet the turn again here for value. Just trying to keep like hands that have some reverse implied in there, like a bad two pair or something like that. I think 10 Jack is kind of unlikely. It's a pretty specific combination of hand that is going to be in there with 10 Jack. I mean, it's pretty easy, especially in PLO, to get in the habit of like always thinking that somebody has the nuts. But let's see. Looks like we stabbed this river. I want to make sure we get the action right. Looks like we played a hand, kind of a speculative hand, but those are always more fun to talk about anyway. Okay. So, yes, we did. We opened from middle position with 9-8, 5-6 with a suit. In a tough game, I would just fold. But these guys, again, like nobody in these games is really like 3-betting me or punishing me for opening a lot, so it's not as bad to continue opening this. But in general, like my standard would be to fold this from middle position. If you like are brand new to a table, you certainly shouldn't be opening this. But with some reads and the right type of table dynamic, I think that opening this can be okay. But in general, like folding it pre-flop is best from this position. Like from the cutoff, I would always open it. From middle position, like I said, I'm much tighter. If I had to put a percentage on it, I would say, in the 15% range from middle position, 10% range from under the gun, about 10% from the small blind, and then just, 40%-ish from the cutoff, and 65 to 80% from the button are like my pretty like standard open frequencies. Decided not to c-bet this flop. We have no equity, and we're facing two players. Like in a heads-up pot, I would probably still c-bet it. But, in a three-way pot when we have no equity, no blockers, no backdoor equity even, I kind of just I think that checking and giving up is okay. There's no rule that says that you have to always c-bet when you miss. I kind of, especially when I first started, I thought that like anytime I didn't have anything, no matter what, I always had to try to win the pot, and that's just not true. I mean, combinatorically, this is a board against two players that's going to connect with someone. So I certainly don't mind just like checking and, giving up. That's fine. And if you are concerned about balance and you want to know how to play against players who are actually paying attention, just remember that it's important, like, in both single raise pots and 3-bet pots, to be balancing your check giving ups with some check raises. You're going to be extremely easy to play against when facing any opponents who, are like competent on any level. If you're just always like check giving up after you raise pre-flop, we don't want that. So let me make sure I get this action right. Looks like I still am like checking and giving up. I talked a little bit about this in another video, but an easy way to burn money, and this happens to a lot of live players, is just like firing one and then like as like a stab, like stabbing as a bluff in a multi-way pot. And I find that that's okay more on like drier and like more static boards than it is in this spot. Like, especially in a multi-way pot, you can almost guarantee that, like, if I bet here, I'm getting called in at least one spot. So unless you have a legitimate chance to win the pot at showdown, or you can like get value from worse, uh, or B, plan on firing a second bet, then you should usually just like continue to check and give up. I've lost a lot of money by just, you know, I've lost a lot of money by just like betting one and then like for when I didn't really know why I was betting. So when boards are dynamic like this, and it's a multi-way single raised pot, and people, they have like it's not threatening for them to call one bet. They almost always do call one bet. So just make sure that you're not losing money by just like kind of aimlessly stabbing around. So again, like what I'm saying is I wouldn't bet here unless I planned on following through on the river. Or unless, like I said, I had a legitimate chance to win the pot. If I had like, ace, king, jack, something, well, that would have bet the flop. But I'm just saying, like in general, like, then I could bet and then check back. But and then I think that like here I almost certainly don't have the best hand, but they're also very weak too. And I just think that like two pair hands are really unlikely, especially for the player behind me. So I'm going to give it a shot and just pot here and try to take it down. And I do. And like, so you might get called light sometimes, but players are scared of pot-sized bets. So I think that like a mistake, if you're going to bet there, you need to bet big. Because again, like where players bluffing or bluff catching frequency is the highest is when pots are small and it's cheap for them to do so, especially when they're in position. So if you're going to bluff in those situations, you need to make it expensive for them. If you think I've fallen into the trap of like, oh man, like I need to betting smaller looks stronger, so I should bet small. But realistically, like players don't even care about that. Table 4 is kind of interesting. It's multi-way. We have an open-ender, a backdoor flush draw, and a shitty flush draw. And we decide to lead. And I think it's just, like, our hand is good enough to play for stacks against these guys. Not a bad turn, I guess. And we just, like, decide to pot and get it in against this other player if he feels inclined to do so. But if I remember right, I think he folds. Yeah, the donking is fine. I think that it's, like, I don't know, given the stacks, I'm not sure that a naked like flush draw is just going to shove it in anyway. So I thought especially with the backdoor flush draw, it was a okay spot to just like lead and barrel. I think that checking is also fine. But I like these boards are kind of fun to hammer on in multi-way pots because people get scared when you donk because you look strong. And we can see that I would have actually missed my monstrous draw, which is hilarious. Gotta love the rabbit. Whoever thought to have the rabbit camo Bovada, thank you very much. It allows a little bit more degeneracy, makes it more fun to play, which is good for everyone involved. I'm surprised that more sites don't have straddling. I mean, I think you can straddle on America's Card Room, but it always kind of makes like it seems like it makes sense for everybody to have straddling on sites. Like I personally, this is actually a cool topic to talk about is straddling for the live players out there. Like when should you straddle? How do I handle straddling? Comes up a lot live, right? You're playing at the casino, and here I would imagine we just see bet on table 4. You're playing at the casino, and the game is kind of going off and the straddles are varying. There's like the two aggressive guys or maybe even like the big weaker players who are like straddling massive amounts. It's like a 2-5 game and there's people putting like $50 straddles out there. The fact is that straddling is typically like negative EV. Like if you can avoid straddling, then do it. But if it's going to ruin the game, then you certainly want to continue straddling to like please the weaker players and keep the game going. Decided to check back the turn on table 4. I think I just felt like he wasn't going to like fold. It's kind of funny. I think I get snapped off here on the river. Nope, he folds. I guess it's just like weakness. I mean, if you can kind of see just from like watching me play and also take it as advice from some experience coaching and playing a lot of like lower stakes poker, players like don't level yourself. All right, see their actions for what they are. Like checking and calling is usually weakness. Big bets and overall aggression are typically strong. So don't overthink it in that way. So like, that guy, he like check called the flop and then checked the other two streets. He's probably pretty weak, so I decided to bluff. And you can make a lot of money like that just by kind of putting it out big bets that you think that people won't call. Granted, like my line didn't make much sense and I'm repping exactly like 10 jack. I don't think that a lot of players at this level are thinking about that. Table 4, we raise pre-flop and of course get a great flop for our hand, but that's, I think overall this is probably one of the worst turns. He definitely has a lot of like queen, king, ace type hands. A lot of 2 pairs now. And although we have the 9 blocker, it's the non-nut straight blocker. But we do have 2 aces, so that makes it less likely that he like turned a straight. It really should be a straight a lot. People take this line, and again, like on this board, he should have the straight a lot, but he gave me a really great price. I decided to call, and I was right. But it should be the straight there, very high percentage of the time. That's pretty much like the only hand we really beat. It's not like he would lead a worse set for value typically, or turn a 2 pair into a bluff. I mean, I would imagine I fold on table 3. I just don't see too many players taking this line as a bluff. Maybe I get sticky and decide to call him, but he does have quads. I'm not really happy with my call, honestly. It's just like, and that's another thing. Like, players are so straightforward on the river. Like, if big bets go in on the river, like, if people are willing to, it's one thing to stab when, it's like a smaller pot. It's quite another for people to put in big river bets when they don't have to. So I would imagine that's just mostly like value hands. Maybe I called for, video value, we'll call it, to see what he had for educational value. But, I mean, in general, this is like certainly a strong hand. Some players I would check this back against. I'm interested to see what I do. I think checking back is fine. If he checks the turn, we can bet, and checking back induces some bluffs, and I don't mind my call as bad now that I checked back the flop. Somehow I thought that I'd like bet the flop, the turn went check check, and he led the river. So I guess my call's not as bad since I'm kind of like at the top of my range here, but certainly looks pretty value-y by this player. And he has all of it. That's certainly the definition of all of it. It's a nice answer. I imagine that I either open or 3-bet the Jack 10 9 6. I do open it. And the player in the button calls. Player in the small blind calls. We see a flop. Flop's Jack 10 9. Oh, I'm sorry. The flop is Queen 4 3 with 2 spades. Kind of some weird action. So again, like, we've talked about what this is, right? This is the best c-betting spot pretty much that there is in 6 max. When we have the pre-flop initiative and we're second to act post-flop, this is where our c-betting frequency should be the highest. So I would have c-bet if it checked me. I typically just treat min bets as checks. I mean, I raise to the amount that I would have c-bet, which I think is good. I mean, in general, like these little min bet, gay bet type things are weak. So, but then he like snap re-raises, and I guess it was strong. With like just a junky flush draw, no pair. It's fine to fold. And for next video, I promise I'm going to have the auto reload button clicked so that we can do that, so that it's not as distracting. Okay, so I want to make sure that I get the action right. Table 4. Okay, so I open on table 4. And we c-bet, which is pretty standard. I mean, I would be c-betting with a super high frequency on this board, regardless of my hand, but it's certainly with an overpair, a gutter, and a queen of diamonds blocker. This is a great spot to c-bet, and just assume we have the best hand most of the time, and that we're going to have some great barreling opportunities. I kind of hope that I just like pot it here and leverage this short stack. Not too happy that he calls, because we could be behind a lot of the time, and we're dead, it looks like. Pretty much. So, I don't know. I'm still pretty happy with how I played that hand. Nothing you could really do. Certainly not going to like check fold. I certainly don't like betting small because there's too many rivers that are going to be awkward to play. We open ourselves to get bluffed. But that's okay. And I think that's where I'm going to stop it for today. We talked a lot about some good topics. We talked about bankroll management. We talked about c-betting opportunities and how high our frequency should be. Remember, like at the low stakes, you want your c-betting and barreling frequency to be pretty high, since that's the best way to pick up dead money against passive players. And talked about kind of opening ranges at different spots at the table, what to look for in terms of player types when you want to open your range or play a little bit tighter. So, as always, please leave your comments and feedback in the forum here. I've gotten a few videos submitted to me from you guys on Skype and over direct message, which is nice. So I'm going to be going over those in the future. I thought I would finish this video here and then move on to some more like, analyzing play from, some members and other like students of mine. So, this is Casino Crime signing off. Let me know if you guys have any other questions. Look forward to talking to you.